I'd like to welcome our guest today, Dr. Solomon Garfunkel, who was a member of the committee that was involved in writing the math standards. So I'd like to welcome you and thank you for participating in this conversation. And I'm wondering if you might just start a little bit by sharing maybe some background about the work you've done in COMAP and some of the underlying philosophies of the work that you've done.
I'm happy to, and thank you for having asked me here today. Let me begin by saying COMAP stands for the Consortium for Mathematics and Its Applications, and we were founded as a nonprofit organization 30 years ago. The point of COMAP was to try to have an answer to students when they say, "What's this stuff good for?" I mean, our philosophy is to teach mathematics through contemporary and real applications. And we've done that from kindergarten through graduate school. We've produced curriculum materials that really take honest-to-God applications of mathematics and teach the mathematics through those applications, both as motivation, but also to say, you know, if you're going to study this stuff, there's a reason that you're studying it. So that's been our motivation all these years.
Actually, you have the answers then to the question, when am I ever going to need this?
Exactly.
Yeah. Have a friend who said, I know that today is not the day I'm going to die because my math teacher said that someday I'm going to have to use that, and I haven't used it yet. So
That's wonderful. I keep renewing my mortgages for 30 years, figuring that God will never let me pay it off. But anyway.
That's another interesting strategy. So, well, welcome, and we're happy to have you and appreciate the philosophy from which you operate. I'm kind of wondering, can you share with us a little bit about what your understanding is about how the committee was selected to actually go about putting the standards together?
Well, as you know, the standards were put together by the National Governors Association and the Chief Council of State Officers. I got that wrong, but at any rate, basically from the states. The argument went that with No Child Left Behind, we had a situation in which we essentially had 50 sets of standards, and we also had 50 sets of high-stakes tests. And to be fair, I mean, that really wasn't a very good situation because you'd have these tests were determined for a variety of reasons, and they weren't all the same. And so you'd have students who would show up in being proficient in one state when they couldn't even reach the 25th percentile on another state's test. So I think that the truth of the matter is that the Obama administration at the Department of Education decided this was really too much. And they worked with the states, even though this is a states organized effort. I think it's certainly one that was supported by the administrations philosophically, and you can see the reason. However, in order to do this, basically the motivation, aside from doing a good job and having students on the same page, was to get as many states as possible to sign on to this. And so it becomes a political phenomenon because some states say, well, we won't sign unless you add this topic. And another state might say, well, we won't sign on unless you take away this topic. And so the group that did this had to be very politically savvy. And one of the things that they did was they formed a very large group of writers. I mean, I was a member of a writing team that had over 40 people on it. Wow. And in addition to that, there were review panels, and then there was a validation committee. I mean, literally hundreds of people were involved in the process. Having said that, there was a smaller group of about 3 people, really of 3 key writers, who had to make the decisions in the end. And so even though if you looked at the philosophical spectrum from the mathematics education point of view of all the writers involved, you'll find that goes from the far left to the far right. On the other hand, when it came down to making the decisions on which topics would be there, the decisions were made by these 3 people with the idea that they wanted to be sure that they got the maximum number of states signing on.
So actually there are kind of a couple of interesting things that you alluded to in there, one of them being that maybe the broad representation had to do with getting broad buy-in, but then the other side of that also has to do with what the final product was going to look like. It actually had to have curb appeal, so to speak, to a large constituency.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So, how do you see that that has influenced what the final product ended up to be?
Well, I think the what's happened to the final product is that it starts to look a little bit like a laundry list of mathematical topics.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if you look at the topics, at the grain size of these standards, they're all over the road. So there are some that are, show deep understanding of blank, and there are some that says solve for X. So you have this very wide range of standards because they were trying to please so many different people.
Yeah.
I think it's also the case, and this may be unfair, but what the hell, I don't mind being unfair, that in the end, they didn't want to anger the research mathematician community. And so in the end, it was a little higher pitched. It was, if you look at the language in particular, say the high school standards, it's not a language that teachers speak. It's a language that researchers speak. And I think the idea was that that was a community in particular that they couldn't afford to really get mad at them.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a certain amount of appeasement that went on as opposed to being a little bit more even-handed, I think, in the end.
So, what are the implications for that for school districts and teachers then? The fact that all of these factors led to the standards as they exist at this point in time. What does that mean for teachers?
Well, I think it means this transition is going to be very ugly. I also think that what it means is that people are waiting for the tests. If you look if you look at the standards themselves, it's very hard to imagine for an average student covering all this material. And for that matter, for an average teacher, because there are things in there that teachers are not comfortable or familiar with. So, in fact, I think people are waiting to see what the tests look like, the tests that are going to be due in 2014, 2015, to see, well, what are they really going to test? Okay, this is what the standards say. This is the full curriculum. This is like handing somebody a textbook, which is 600 pages, and you can only cover 300 in the course of the year. So the question is, what's really valued? And what's valued is going to be what's tested. And so I think teachers are waiting to see that. Unfortunately, what do we do in the interim? Because for now, we don't have those tests. We have to go back and rely on the existing state tests or the existing high stakes tests that are out there. So I think it's a difficult transition until we see what the assessments look like.
Yeah, that brings up kind of an interesting point because, to some degree, then it might be possible that test makers are going to maybe provide definition about what the standards themselves mean just by the way that they decide to assess those items. Comments?
Absolutely, and I should say that in two levels. One level is the content, just simply what. There's so much content in these standards, so what content will actually be tested. But the other thing, which is very important, and everybody in the math education community talks about this, are the practices. Because the practice standards talk about things like making sense, reasonableness, modeling, using technology, all of these nice things that were so strongly mentioned in the NCTM standards. However, those practice standards are not in the present version of the CCSSM, they're not incorporated. So the question then becomes, well, it's one thing to talk about all these nice things about deep understanding and so on, but if the tests turn out to be multiple choice, or they turn out to be things that can only be machine scorable and can be normed nicely by the psychometricians, then maybe it's hard to test that. And if you don't test it, means you don't value it, means we're not going to teach it.
Yeah.
And so that's where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah, that's kind of a discussion that I've heard even in our own state as well. I think we certainly saw that with the last set of standards that were adopted here in Kansas, that we had an over-attention or over-focus on those items that were assessed, and the others were kind of a get-to if we had time kind of thing. So it did drive instruction.
Assessment always drives instruction.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a tautology.
Yeah, absolutely.